Democracy Now!, Amy Goodman. We're on the road in Buenos Aires, Argentina. When we flew in yesterday, our first stop here in the Argentine capital was the Plaza de Mayo, where mothers of the disappeared continue to march every Thursday afternoon, holding the pictures of their children and grandchildren who were disappeared. 30,000 people were disappeared during Argentina's military dictatorship, which ended in 1983. Well, 2 weeks ago, tens of thousands of people gathered here in Buenos Aires to mourn the passing of the former Argentine president, Néstor Kirchner. He headed Argentina from 2003 to 2007 as it struggled to recover from a crippling financial meltdown. His wife, Cristina Kirchner, is the current president of Argentina. Today, she's in South Korea taking part in the G20 summit. This, as a group of financiers took out an ad in the Wall Street Journal demanding Argentina be thrown out of the G20. See, in 2001, Argentina defaulted on $95 billion in foreign loans. The next 2 years saw record protests and social upheavals, and unemployment was at an all-time high. Soon after taking office in May 2003, Néstor Kirchner told the International Monetary Fund Argentina would only give its creditors 35 cents back for every dollar they were owed. The IMF restructured Argentina's debt. Néstor Kirchner is also credited with reforming the judiciary and armed forces and paving the way for dozens of trials involving people accused of torture and other abuses during the military dictatorship. We'll talk more about these trials later in the show today. But first, we go to some analysis of the economic transformations in Argentina since the massive street protests of 2001. Joining me here in Buenos Aires is Ezequiel Adamovsky. He's a historian at the University of Buenos Aires. He's been involved in the student movement and the neighborhood assemblies that emerged in Buenos Aires after the protest in December 2001. Welcome to Democracy Now! Professor Adamovsky, Ezequiel, talk about what happened. For viewers and listeners who are watching and listening all over the world right now, put Argentina in a political and geopolitical context.
Well, I think the most important thing to take into account was that Argentina during the 1990s was the most extreme experiment in neoliberal transformation. We had the most radical program of reforms at that time, which ended up in massive unemployment, the impoverishment of more than half of the population of the country. And in 2001, finally, the collapse of the whole economic system. At the same time, we had a crisis of credibility in the political system. So since more or less every single political party was proposing the same types of measures, neoliberal measures, population lost confidence in all politicians at the same time. So in 2001, we had the vast majority of the population rejecting neoliberal measures and not having any political alternative in the established political parties as to how to continue ruling this country. So that was the moment in which the rebellion happened. And the rebellion was basically, at the same time, a rejection of austerity measures and also a rejection of the political system. The main slogan of the rebellion was, they must all go, meaning that all politicians should leave the political scene. So apparently there was no political alternative then. But the most interesting aspect of the rebellion was that precisely at that moment, large social movements started to experiment new forms of political representation, new political slogans and programs. And some of the measures that you just mentioned, which Néstor Kirchner took after 2003, were actually the measure that the rebellion itself was proposing. For example, the renewal of the Supreme Court was one of the demands of this vast social movements in 2000 and 2001.
What do you mean, the renewal of the Supreme Court?
Well, Néstor Kirchner is credited with changing the utterly corrupt Supreme Court that we had in the 90s with a new one that we have now, with more or less respectable judges. And that was one of the main demands of the rebellion in 2001.
How did you participate? And I mean, the significance for people to understand these protests in 2001, the uprising in the streets. How many people were in the streets? I mean, you had very much, the middle class out, as well as the students smashing the windows of banks.
That is right. It's impossible to say how many people participated, but in the rebellion of December 2001, it was millions of people in the streets in Buenos Aires, but also in most of the cities throughout the countries. And it was the middle class, but also the lower classes in the outskirts of cities as well. So it was a very special moment of solidarity between lower and middle classes against these neoliberal measures.
You have written several books. One of them is called Anti-Capitalism for Beginners, the New Generation of Emancipatory Movements. What do you mean?
Well, that book was about trying to communicate wider audiences the ideas that social movements in Argentina were debating at that time. So we had the sense that we were debating all sorts of new ideas, but we didn't have channels as to spread all these ideas to larger audiences. So the basic idea was that we were experiencing then the birth of a new family of anti-capitalist movements, different from anti-capitalists of the past, at the same time being heritors of that tradition, but also experimenting with new ideas and trying to reach better outcomes than the movements of the past.
Ezequiel Adamovsky, it's interesting, your latest book is called The History of the Middle Class, and there's a lot of discussion of the middle class in the United States because of the economic pressure and the economic meltdown in the United States. Will the middle class last there? But why did you write a book on the history of the middle class? How has it changed here in Argentina?
Well, I think I wrote that book without knowing it, perhaps, because I believe that there's no deep social change possible without solidarity between the lower class and at least part of the middle class. And since I believe that the capitalist political system is about separating those two classes in different fields, I think that the most important challenge that we have, politically speaking, is to reunite part of the middle class with lower class in new kind of bonds and links of solidarity. In Argentina, the middle class suffered a process of impoverishment throughout the 90s. There was a new phenomenon called the new poor, meaning people who used to be middle class, but they were now poor people. And that process, funnily enough, it reapproached from the identity viewpoint, the identity of the middle class, impoverished middle class, and the lower class. And historically speaking, in Argentina, there was a big gap between those two. The middle class usually rejecting any contact with poor people, but that slightly changed in the 90s. And in part, the 2001 rebellion was possible due to that.
One of